Good morning and good afternoon and good whenever you're listening to this podcast, beautiful people. This is the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the show, Olga Peters, and this is the show where we talk about how everything in Montpelier shakes out for the rest of us. Unfortunately, regular contributor Emily Kornheiser couldn't be here today, but luckily, I have someone who's great too. Uh, I want to welcome to the show Representative Tristan Roberts. He represents Wyndham 6 down here in Wyndham County, and those are the towns of Wilmington, Whitingham, and Halifax. He has served on the House Committee on Corrections and Institutions, also with the Legislative Committee on Judicial Rules. He is a farmer, always near and dear to my heart, and the chief technologist for the Health Product Declaration Collaborative, which is an organization that works with the building industry to try to get toxic chemicals out of building materials. So, Tristan, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Thank you, Olga. It's a pleasure to be here on your show. And I'm excited to talk to you and to listeners today.
Well, it's fun for me because, as most listeners know, I'm in Whitingham. So we are actually neighbors, and you're in Halifax, like right over the little brook. So it's fun to be talking to someone in my neck of the woods.
And I'm proud to represent you in Montpelier, Olga.
Why, thank you. Well, it's a little bittersweet because, of course, you will be serving out the rest of your term, which ends in January, but you have decided not to run for reelection. And I could not let this moment pass without getting to really kind of mine your thoughts on what it has meant to serve, both the pros and the cons, and then also some of the things you worked on this session. So, if you don't mind, Tristan, where I'd like to start is, so often when we talk about Wyndham County, we often talk about what I would call sort of the eastern side or like the Connecticut River side. Brattleboro, Bellows Falls, Putney, Rockingham. We often talk about those because they tend to have the biggest population centers. So I'm curious for you, what has it been like serving Wilmington, Whitingham, and Halifax? Have you seen different needs? Have you seen different wants from your constituents? Like, give us a flavor of that.
Yeah, I think Halifax, Whitingham, and Wilmington, we are unique towns. And what goes on in Brattleboro or what goes on in Burlington does not represent what goes on in these three towns. There are common themes and similarities, but of course we are unique. And that as a representative, it's really my job to listen to constituents, to listen to my own best judgment and vote accordingly. And I think that does lead to some unique perspectives or unique votes. As an example, I and I think we really have to think about when we're evaluating a bill, you have to really think about what problem is this trying to solve.
Mm-hmm.
You might go on to say whose problem is this trying to solve? And you might ask, well, how are different people trying to solve this problem? And I think when you look in our local communities, you see different approaches to problem solving. And that an example where that informed me as a representative was I voted against H 875, and that was a bill that would require, and it passed, by the way. And I think that's fine and well. I don't really have anything against the bill, but it wasn't the right fit for my district. I felt that it would require municipalities to adopt a statewide code of ethics and to do annual ethics training. Now, ethics has been a huge issue in Halifax.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, it was part of how I got elected to the select board in 2021. And I'm really proud to say that since then, we've updated our conflict of interest policy and we've used it. Our ethics have been living, breathing conversation for us in Halifax. And I hear the same from folks in Whitingham who contacted me about this bill. Another thing about living in Southern Wyndham County, as you know, Olga, we're very distant from law enforcement.
Yes.
Community is up to us. Safety is really something that's in our own hands most of the time. And this bill at the ethical level is kind of like that. It says thou shalt to the towns without actually giving any new enforcement.
Mhm.
Um, so what I heard from towns was, hey, we're already doing this, and ethics is something is never going to be perfect in any town. But I think the best way to approach a topic like this is to stay engaged with it, to develop the long-term relationships that matter. And ultimately, it's up to citizens. It's up to an engaged citizenry to say, to keep an eye on their boards and the municipalities and their officials and say, hey, I like what you're doing here. I don't like that here. And that holds elected officials accountable. So that really local, community-based approach, I think, is something that's strong in our towns. You go into an urban environment, like a Burlington, and cities are different. Cities often operate in ways that having credentials, having trainings, there is law enforcement on the ground. There are lawyers around every corner. So I think some of these bills make sense um, in those cities, and I might vote for them as a representative of those places. But I listened to the unique district that we live in, and on that bill, felt that it was a no.
I think you bring up another good point, especially with law enforcement. Emily and I have joked on this show before where things have happened in my life, and she's like, "Well, did you call the police?" And I'm like, "No, I called my neighbors." Like, what police?
Yeah.
um, but I think H875 also raised a really interesting conundrum I see in Windham County too, between like a larger town like Rockingham with the village of Willows Falls, um, and Brattleboro specifically, is that difference between the type of resources you have when you are a fully professionalized
Yes.
municipality versus some of our smaller towns that you basically have the select board, the library, the town clerk, and maybe a road commissioner.
Yes.
And that's it for your town. That's a
Yeah.
very different type of work you can get done.
And this often, I think you name this well, and this often places me as a skeptic or a sort of a voice. This is a place where I have and I see and I admire my other colleagues who do this, and they all do it. Advocate for rural districts, advocate for uh, our smaller towns. Even Wilmington has a designated downtown village, but it's the
Mhm.
smallest of all the 23 or so in the
That's right.
state. So even
That's right.
Wilmington, which has an identifiable village downtown with diverse retail, is the one of the smallest in the states. We have two unincorporated villages in Whitingham and none in Halifax. And that has to be spoken to at a state level. Whether you're contemplating a policy like the Affordable Heat Act, S5, or whether you're contemplating a housing bill, these bills often are set up to incentivize a certain kind of behavior, and maybe
Mm.
set up funding mechanisms to, okay, let's create some funding here and move the funding over here to incentivize this behavior. And of course, anytime you're moving funding around like that, or you're setting up uh, mechanisms, there are qualifiers. Someone has to sign up for the program. The town has to raise their hand and fill out a complicated form and to access funding. They have to have certain things in place already that towns like ours often don't.
Mhm.
And there is a tendency for policies to not to sort of be well crafted for a Middlebury or Waterbury, a South Burlington, a Montpelier, um, and not to make as much sense when you come to a more rural town. And that's true. I think being in Southern Windham County, we feel that invisibility sometimes. My constituents often say, we're not even on the Channel 3 weather map.
No,
Um,
we're where Channel 3 weather person stands in front of, so
yes.
they can tell you what's happening everywhere else.
Yeah. But as I've traveled around the state, as I've gotten to know Vermont better through this job, and I understand that there's every corner of the state has places that feel that way, and every individual in some ways feels overlooked. So kind of everyone feels that way, and every town feels different. So it's not special to us, but that is the job of the representative to voice to go. It's my job to go to Montpelier with these stories in my knapsack to talk about what's going on down in the village in Halifax, and the sewer upgrade that Whitingham is dealing with, and how the permit application has been held up with A&R, and A&R doesn't seem to understand the particularities. So you just got to constantly be voicing, here's our story, and um, to be at the table when decisions are being made, when tax policies are being set, when programs are being administered.
Mm-hmm. And how about for you? I know Windham County is often thought of as being along the political spectrum very, very blue. And I would say our three towns this that we're talking about are probably a little bit more purple
Mhm.
in some of its voting habits. Does that
Yeah.
influence kind of some of your thinking around policy or
Yeah. We'll take people that don't know, people from outside Vermont that don't know Vermont that well. Um, they probably, Ben and Jerry's, maple syrup is what they know about Vermont. And then politically, oh, Bernie. And pretty blue state, right?
Mhm.
Vermont is the most reliably Democratic president, voting state presidentially. And I think there's a conception that, okay, so we're liberal. Okay, so we have a so-called Democratic supermajority in the House and in the Senate, um, very moderate Republican governor. You would think that would trend towards maybe liberal policy. And my experience in Montpelier is that it's just much more complicated than that. You
Mhm.
put 150 representatives in the House, and that's 150 different people from different towns with different lived experience, different professional backgrounds. You put those 11 representatives on a committee like the committee I serve on, House Corrections and Institutions, and there's a whole spectrum of viewpoints from, on the topic of corrections, we should people trending towards we should pretty much decarcerate, try to close prisons, get people out of prisons, and other you hear other legislators say maybe we should incarcerate more people.
Mhm.
Um, so I think it's probably human nature. You pick any topic, you're going to get a spectrum of viewpoints. I think the blue and red stuff is kind of cable TV nonsense that certainly if you look at the voting history of my district, it trends a bit more conservative than Vermont as a whole. Um, but I've certainly tried to keep that in mind and listen carefully to, even when constituents I know they didn't vote for me, they had the other guy sign on their lawn, they email me regularly to tell me how much they disagree with me. I read every email and listen and really consider their point of view every time. And I think that's, everyone approaches the job with in that way. I think everyone would tell you there's a lot more to it than blue, red, purple.
Mhm. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I do at some point want to talk about your experience serving and your choice to originally serve and and now step away. But before we do that, I'd love to talk a little bit about your work on the Committee on Corrections and Institutions, because I think you did say something so profound that if you don't grow up in a community that doesn't have a police force, you don't think of these things. But you said, safety is somewhat up to us to a certain extent
Yeah.
in these towns without designated police departments. Um, so, with your work on corrections and institutions, what will you be taking away from that work? Like, what has stood out to you while you served on it?
Um, it's been I could sort of consider it like a 2-year just crash course in the topic of corrections. I was speaking of sort of how we do this work. We don't have any correctional facilities in my district. The closest one is in Springfield. It's over an hour away. That facility and most other of the 6 correctional facilities in Vermont are up a road that generally most citizens don't drive down that road unless going to that facility. And yet these are facilities that it just really struck me how heavily when a close loved one went through a mental health crisis, and I accompanied them to the emergency room to get evaluated. And then they were held at the emergency room until an inpatient psychiatric bed opened up. And they resided there for a week. And we have a mental health care system and a healthcare system where if you're in crisis, you're having a bad day in Vermont, and calling a hotline isn't going to cut it. And the family, you don't have the support you need where you are. You have two options in our system where you can show up in crisis and you will have a bed over roof over your head, and you'll have a bed to reside in, and you'll be somewhat taken care of. And that's our emergency medical, our emergency departments, and then some of the facilities that people arrive at from there. And then that's our criminal justice system and our correctional institutions. Every person, residing of all of the 1,800 or so individuals incarcerated in Vermont today for one reason or another, over 60% of them have diagnosed with opioid use disorder. If you add other substance uses like alcohol, it gets up, probably you're getting close to 90% of people incarcerated have a substance dependency, have a mental health issue, or other severe health issues. And these are individuals that aren't doing well in our society. They're in one way or another, and they end up, I think through, let's not take away their personal responsibility, but through a variety of life choices, they end up behind bars. And we have these systems that take these individuals in, and these systems are pretty much out of sight, out of mind for most Vermonters. And that included myself until serving on this committee. So it was something when I came home to talk to constituents about my work in Montpelier. Talking about the correctional system is not a question I get asked by anyone. But I try to make it a point to talk about it because it's just as essential to our society right now as our healthcare system, just as sort of it can't fail. We have to keep that system running 365 days a year, 24/7, or our basic assumptions of what safety means in our society need to be reexamined. And that system is very threadbare right now in terms of staffing, in terms of the quality of the facilities, in terms of the programming. So we're running a really threadbare system that most Vermonters don't spend a lot of time thinking about or looking at. So I spent a lot of my time on that in the last 2 years, not only in the committee, but outside of committee on my own time, visiting correctional facilities, talking to individuals incarcerated there, talking to families of victims, just to get to know the system so that I could add my voice to the conversation on that policy as well as possible.
And where you feel, you mentioned threadbare on a couple times. Tell me more about that. Like, and what does that mean? Like, this is going to sound very callous, but like, why should we care?
Sure, I'll give you a good example. We have, right now, we're at a 16% or so vacancy rate for correctional officers in Vermont. So we have about 700 correctional officers statewide, and and it should be more than that by 16%. So that means that there are positions that are not filled, such as volunteer coordinator is a position that isn't filled at some facilities. There are officers doing 16-hour shifts one day after another. And then they get a 3-day weekend every other weekend. So it's sort of you work hard, put in long hours, and then you get some time with your family. And the pay is decent. So I really salute the people that are working hard at this job. If they're being overtired, overtaxed, overstressed, and I don't know anyone that does their best work when you're overtaxed like that. And so what we tend to do is revert to the kind of the minimum. We tend to have there's not a lot going on in our correctional facilities. There are not a lot of volunteer classes. There's not a lot of training opportunities or educational opportunities. There's not a lot of active casework. And for all intents and purposes, it can be said that we are warehousing many of our inmates in Vermont. Now, when someone who is incarcerated for maybe whether it's 12 months or whether it's 12 years, and they're exiting that, they've paid their dues to society. We had a statutory obligation while they were paying their dues to provide rehabilitative services and program.
Right. Yeah.
And when that person comes back into the community and they don't have any relevant job training, they might not know how to do basic things like how to do laundry, how to cook for themselves. They might not have a driver's license. They might be exiting a correctional facility without a vital prescription for medications. They might be exiting a correctional facility, basically homeless or being put into finding the only bed available in a housing facility that might not be good for them actually, because they're trying to not use drugs, and there might be drugs being used in that facility.
Mm-hmm.
So when those individuals recidivate, when they again do crimes, or otherwise cause problems for other people in the community, well, I think very selfishly we should be thinking about, are we doing a good job here so that we can be safe? And is this right? Is this morally okay that we are, someone they might be guilty of a crime, they're doing their time. Well, punishing them, sort of having that time be in a punitive environment where your health degrades, where your mind degrades, where your skills degrade, where your social interactions become just based around sort of prison tribalism, when you're not being offered opportunity for growth. Especially, and the number of detainees in our correctional facilities is rising. So we're over 400 people who are detained awaiting trial. And given the backlogs in our judicial system, which you've probably heard about, cases taking years to be adjudicated, individuals in a correctional facility waiting to be adjudicated are not receiving any programming. They're not receiving any casework, and that's just kind of by design. You don't want to, you might not want to agree to anger management training if you're awaiting trial, because that's something you get ordered after a trial.
Right.
And you don't want to admit guilt. You can't just take someone and slap this stuff on, and we pretty much leave these folks alone, and we don't work with them. And then they're often released from court with time served after maybe 12 months, 18 months, with exactly zero casework. Now, are we doing the right thing for them? Are we doing the right thing for our community? We're not. And I think this affects every Vermonter. And it's hard to talk about because, victims of crime don't like to speak about that publicly. They didn't choose to be a victim of crime generally, and talking about it publicly is generally not their favorite thing to do. So we don't necessarily hear as much as we should about how these failures are affecting everyone, but they are. And I think one thing I learned from that committee was this really needs to be looked at. And 2 years was certainly certainly not been enough to do that. It's going to be an ongoing issue, and I'm glad the legislature is closely looking at it, and we have made progress in this session.
Well, and I can imagine too, you started talking about this experience saying when someone's in mental health crisis, we have two avenues, the ER or the correction system for a lot of people with mental health issues. So I can imagine people aren't getting their mental health needs met either if the correctional facility they're in isn't fully
Right.
staffed.
Correctional facility, it's um, access to mental health care, access to any kind of health care, including mental health care in correctional facilities, is very lacking. It's been very well documented. Um, you know, we have a for-profit healthcare provider in our prisons, WellPath, and we just uh, and they do subpar work. It's pretty well documented. No surprise. Uh, and we're not doing good mental health care. And these are folks. So these folks, in some ways, prison offers folks a structured environment, right? Where you don't want to be. Um, I've been inside an inpatient psychiatric facility, and it's not a place you want to be in necessarily, but it is a safe place.
Mhm.
Um, and our correctional facilities are maybe ironically a safer place to be for those individuals than wherever else they were.
Mhm.
But that's not saying much about the quality of a facility and what that does for them.
Thank you, Tristan. We are just out of time before we have to hear from some underwriters. I told you it was going to go fast
Yeah.
on WVEW. But before we leave this part of the conversation, I just want to touch base. Anything you want to leave listeners with at this point? Um,
Well, we're coming back though.
yes.
Okay. Well, I'll say this now and I'll say it again. I just want to encourage people to volunteer and get more involved in their communities. And I'll say more about that after the break. But this is something that um, I think in stepping up to serve, I saw it as a service for myself, and I found in many ways it was more gratifying and more engaging and fit better into my life than I thought it would. And so I try to sort of talk about that as a way of encouraging people that you might feel like your life is full, but when you make room for service, you can find more room for it, and we do need people to do that.
Wonderful. Thank you. So, Tristan Roberts, Representative Tristan Roberts, and I will be back after the break here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. So, don't go anywhere, folks. Welcome back to the second half of the Montpelier Happy Hour here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station. I'm your host and producer of the Montpelier Happy Hour. And I've been speaking with Representative Tristan Roberts from Wyndham 6, which is Wilmington, Whitingham, Halifax, although he's been talking to me from his very lovely farm, Quilnook Farm in Halifax. Thank you for being here, Tristan.
Thank you, Olga. Really been enjoying the show, and I'm looking forward to the second half.
Well, before we dive in, I have a couple housekeeping things I have to do. First, we always like to thank Brattleboro Community Television for taking the video version of this show and sharing it with similar stations around Vermont. And just so everyone knows, in case you forgot from last week, the views and opinions of everyone on the Montpelier Happy Hour are those of the hosts and the guests, and not the platform, not their bosses, not their houseplants, not their friends and family, just us. So if anyone's going to get in trouble, it will just be us. Are you ready for that, Tristan?
Welcome to my last 2 years.
Well, Tristan, I loved what you said at the end of the first half. You were talking about the value of service and what that can mean for a community. And I think, so much of Vermont runs on volunteer labor. And there's a number of people who talk about how people should be compensated for their time more often. And I think we'll get to this a little bit when we talk more about your experience in the State House. So I'm curious for you, what has service meant for your life, not just as a representative, but just on the select board? And why do you feel that that's an important part of being part of a community?
I think ever since I became a father 12 and a half years ago, and really the reason I wanted to become a father was I felt and knew there'd be meaning in my life, and it was important to me to be responsible for something outside of myself. And becoming a father was one of the ways I chose to do that. having buying land in Halifax and creating a farm where I steward this land, and I'm feel, it's one of the most important things to me to sort of be a good steward of the land here. And when I get up in the morning, Olga, and I'm thinking, okay, what should I do today? The things that inspire me the most are the things that I think are touchstones for me of meaning are, what can I do for my son? What can I do for I want to go out there and do something on the farm, take care of something. Like these are just, um, our American culture is very me focused, me. Um, and I think that is intentional based on our consumerism and the advertising that encourages us to take care of ourselves and buy stuff, to satisfy our specific desires. And that's wonderful. And I enjoy um, taking care of myself, and it's certainly important. Um, but being in a small town of 800 people, a few years ago when the select board, uh, there was some, uh, we went from a 3-person board to a 5-person board, and there were going to be a couple seats in the election. And we were looking around and saying, just, okay, who's going to run? Who's going to run? And in a town of 800 people, there are a couple hundred that are pretty engaged in the civic life of the community, maybe a couple dozen that are, um, engaged enough that you see them a lot of things. It's not that many people. And so I just couldn't hide from it. I said, well, I think I'm qualified. I think I have a good head on my shoulders. I think I can help. So I'll run for select board. Sure. I didn't want to spend my evenings at a meeting. Or I didn't think I did. But then I did, and I said, there's more to this than I realized. Developing those relationships, contributing, having an impact. It does feel good. And I think that needs to be said. That needs to be said more often. I think anyone that volunteers their time and I think finds that there is inherent good in that, and people find that in their own ways and in different in their lives. And I'm someone that has found that through the select board, and then running for state rep was similar, where I felt like this is surprisingly, given based on how much I was told by the media that politics is toxic, I was genuinely surprised how just pleasurable it was to drive around, walk around, and talk to people about politics. And it was pleasurable because I got to know people. I got to go beyond the surface of, oh, they have a Trump sign. They haven't. Well, I got to go below the surface of that, and that was cool. Or they have a Black Lives Matter sign. What does that mean to them? And I got to go below the surface of that, and that was cool. And I just encourage people to find that in their lives, wherever they might do so. And that was, I forget your question now. Why did I run? What was it about?
No, you answered my question. That was perfect.
Okay.
I think what I would add to that, what you've sparked for me thinking that through is, I think serving and volunteering for your community also, I know this word gets overused, but it can be very empowering, because I think so often we look at government, whether it's at the municipal level or the state or the federal, as something that happens to us.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're involved in your community, you actually get to see how things work or don't. And hopefully you can be a part of that and hopefully make something better. But I think
Yeah, I'm a
having a
hands-on
chance
learner.
to understand how things work is really powerful.
I'm a hands-on learner. I think a lot of people are hands-on learners. You don't really understand something until you've lived it, until you've gone through it. Is my experience. And being a state representative, going to Montpelier, serving on a committee, this taught me what I didn't even know what a legislature does. Like, I knew legislators. I knew they went up to Montpelier January through May. I knew it was a pretty full-time job, Tuesday through Friday, January through May, and then they're off the rest of the year. And I'm thinking, like, but what do they do? And And I think I've got an answer to that. I got, I know what they do now, and I think the best way I describe that is by um, we try to sort of predict the future and design our society for the future. Um, the governor sort of deals with the present and deals with administering the programs we have. The treasurer pays for it. The secretary of state keeps the filing cabinet. The attorney general sort of monitors the rules for the people, and the auditor watches the money. But legislators have this unique job of looking at the problems of the present and sort of hashing them out to design the future. Um, and that's a job we pay $800 a week for, by the way, which is not enough to live on. And I looked it up. We pay our governor. We're budgeted to pay our governor $4,300 a week in FY the next fiscal year, compared to $800 a week for a legislator. So this is a hugely important job in terms of imagining the future, and one we don't compensate that well, interestingly enough.
Well, that brings me to my next question. It's a part A, part B question, and it's, what first inspired you to serve, but then what changed so that you have decided to step away?
I'll put a number on it. Why I ran the number 7.4. And I'm cheating a little bit because this is a more recent number, but just to give you a sense, 7.4 in a recent 3-month period in 2023, that was the percentage chance that if you are a female between the ages of 15 and 25 and you are hospitalized, you went into the ED in Windham County, Vermont, that 7.4% or 7.4 out of 100 of those ED visits were for suicidality. So someone is done some self-harm, they're strongly thinking about doing self-harm, they're in crisis. And that number was going sharply up. It had only recently been closer to 5%. It was creeping up to 7.4 last I checked. I checked this morning to sort of update that, and good news, suicidality is down in the year 2024. But I have been very concerned that our youth in particular, I think all of us are hearing loud and clear from our leaders that the future is a bleak place, between climate change, between energy crisis, between wars. There's a lot of concerns about the future, and I'm particularly concerned about our youth and whether our youth are seeing themselves as a part of that future. Of course, I have a son, and I have another child I'm expecting in August, so that's important to me as a parent. But I think any person in the community, we want to be thinking about what is the future of this community, and to sort of contribute, to bring my concerns to the table, contribute to that conversation was at the base of it my motivation for running.
Thank you, Tristan. And I know one reason you're stepping away is you and your partner are expecting a new baby in August. Congratulations.
Thank you, Olga.
And that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But I'm wondering what else about serving in the legislature maybe did or did not work for someone who is also a parent and a farmer and running their own business.
Yeah, I mean, I think our representational democracy is broken, where it is very, we go to the ballot box, we have a primary in August, and we have a general election in November. And according to how the system is set up, that's when we decide who represents us, those primary and general elections. Well, if we don't have, most of the time, in our district, we don't have contested primaries. And we don't always have contested general elections for this role or for many other roles, both at a state level and a town level. We're not seeing people there are exceptions, but in many cases, we're not seeing people step up to serve. So it's not just me that has to weigh my family; it's everyone has to weigh their individual situation. And for our district, from for me, it's 2 hours. I would leave Monday night or Tuesday morning, go up to Montpelier and stay there for the week. Try to be home Friday for dinner. Now with a 12-year-old, who I'm not sort of a primary caregiver on a day-to-day basis. I'm sharing that with his mom and my partner. And he understands. He's at an age where his world is getting bigger, and he's like, I think it's been a great experience for me and for our relationship, for him to see me go to this place and take on this new job. Um, but that's a very different conversation with an infant in my arms, or with a partner who's waking up to feed that infant. So our family calculus just changed, and that uh, and I think for working parents, you don't see a lot of parents of young children in the legislature. You don't see a lot of people. You don't see anyone keep up a full-time. You cannot have a full-time job
Mhm.
January to May and be in the legislature. There's just it can't be done, and that certainly affects how we're represented.
Mhm.
Um, if I think I looked for what I tried to be creative about. I felt really grateful and honored to have this privilege to be able to run and to serve. Um I took out a home equity loan a couple years ago and really have relied on sort of savings and a smaller amount of income over the last couple of years to be able to do this, but I couldn't do that forever. Still, I tried to make it possible. We talked about, do we need to like buy a multifamily home in the Montpelier area as an investment, be able a place to be able to live, move the whole family up during the session or for the week so that I could just go home and have dinner and wake up together as a family. So I looked at ways to do that. I looked at just ways to mitigate the stress. Um, and after a while, it felt like, I'm doing a lot to try to sort of hang on to something. That's just to say, step away.
Mhm.
Let it be someone else. This can be someone else can step up and serve our district for the next couple of years, or next, you know, as long as they are elected. Um, and certainly, I am one thing that I've learned from this role. I'm so grateful for this job, and I think more people should have the opportunity to serve. I certainly think there should be turnover in elected positions. Um, and certainly it is hard to get people to serve, but hanging on to the job, when it's a sort of a toss up about whether it makes sense in my personal life, hanging on to the job because, well, it's going to be hard to get someone else to serve. Well, just let there be an opening and let someone else show up and make the decision that I did.
Mhm.
And I'm so excited for who that person will be. And I think more people should try to do this and get out and talk to their neighbors.
I think you raise an interesting dilemma, Tristan, that I often refer to as theory versus practice, because we have this very noble concept in our legislature of being a citizen legislature, that
Mhm.
no one's in it to be a professional politician. They're not in it for money. They're not in it for greed. Some of those more negative connotations that we might have of other governments or at the federal level. And that, like I said, is very noble. However, I don't know that we make it easy for people to actually fill that role, because even though you're only in session from January to May, you're still doing constituent work and serving on working groups and other committees during that off time. Or some people are. And yeah, if we want a diversity of life experience, not everyone can afford to take such low pay and be away from a full-time job
Yeah.
for that long. And I think it's just I don't have a solution. I just think it's a very interesting tension that that
Yeah.
exists.
And I think we should take this seriously, Olga. It is a political hot potato because uh, the legislature is kind of the punching bag for society right now.
Mhm.
We have strong feelings pro and con about our chief executives generally, and that kind of falls on party lines. But universally, just the Congress and legislature are. I think people are unhappy in many ways with how the government is working right now, and the legislature is the easiest place to pick on. So, um, pay is low, respect is low. People are accustomed to talking very negatively to legislators, and feel that they're entitled to do that. Um, so I think we should really take this seriously. How we regard our legislature, how we treat it, how we think about the individuals there, really reflects the quality of the work they do. Um, and we should take that seriously. And I think one piece of that I learned, um, and really wrestled with, was the emphasis we have on seniority. Um,
Mm.
Both, when you look at the federal level, and we have senators who run term after term after term because they accumulate seniority. Um, and like, could someone else do that job and bring new energy and new ideas to the job of senator, um, or on the state level? Absolutely. But it's, in some ways, once you get seniority, there is power that comes with that, and there's benefits that come with that to your constituents. So it becomes counter to your productive to sort of let go of it. So actually, so certainly walking away after one term was not what I expected to do. I thought, okay, once I'm in it, I want to put in a strong run and see what I can do. Uh, so part of what made it a difficult decision to walk away, not seek reelection this year, was knowing that I'm not accumulating that seniority that is so important in our House and in our Senate and in all our political apparatus.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
and I don't think that necessarily represents, that certainly is a way of organizing things that we do as humans in these hierarchical structures, but it's not how we have to organize things, and it's not necessarily getting us the best outcomes.
Right. Right. You're not the first person who has served in the state house to say something similar. Um,
Yeah.
so that is interesting to me.
And
Um,
yet it's hard for, if uh I was part of a pretty large class of freshman legislators, there was a lot of turnover.
right.
Um, and there's sort of no, when you're, there's not necessarily a strength in numbers there. It's hard to, when you're a freshman legislator, you can't sort of organize as a block of freshmen and say, okay, we're going to overturn the seniority. Like, no, we're just like getting to know, where the fire exits are.
I was
For
going
the,
to say bathrooms, but yeah.
yeah. Um, well, it's a very accessible building, so knowing where the exits are is important. Um, and so it is the hierarchy. We invest a lot of power in the hierarchy, and that's a choice that we've made as sort of a society. That choice then perpetuates itself because
Mhm.
the new people coming in don't have any way to kind of overturn that,
Mhm.
without some sort of like compelling. Uh, it's. I think you see what I'm saying. So
Yeah.
we should just really, I don't have answers. I don't, it is what it is, but it's important to understand that affects what we're getting. And I often get disgruntled emails from constituents saying, "Hey, why didn't you do more about this?" And I think people were, an example of a bill that a lot of people were disappointed in this year was the yield bill, where we set the tax rate for the
Mhm.
state, and people felt, rightly so, that the tax rate is increasing too much.
Right.
Well, I think every single legislator in that building agrees. And yet I voted yes on that bill. The bill's passed, many people with strong yes votes, because, hey, we have to set a tax rate that meets the votes of the local districts.
The
We
budget votes.
The budget votes.
Yeah.
So I can want for your taxes to be lower, but without a solution, without a proposal, without an idea that does that, I don't have a way of doing that. So it's a study in sort of what is possible,
Mhm.
and a lot of things are hard to change. A lot of things there aren't ready solutions. for problems, or we probably would have already done them.
Right, right. Yeah. If it was easy.
Yeah.
So we have just about 5 minutes left, Tristan, and I'm curious for anyone who might be considering to serve or the person who might be running for your seat, thoughts, advice, words of warning.
um, I really want people to know, again, I think there's a perception of red versus blue, and there are, I think, loud and shrill voices at the federal level and the state level that are shouting at each other.
Mhm.
You know, there was recently coverage in VT Digger, where some of the key leaders in the legislature and the state said, yeah, we talked past each other a lot this session at the leadership level, and that's not good. So I also want to just let people know that nuanced conversation is really possible, and I want to encourage people to seek it out, and I want to validate that you are entitled to nuanced conversation. You are entitled to your unique opinion. You have no obligation to sort of fall in line with other people's opinions. You can speak your voice safely, and it's important to do so. And example of this is our H-876. It's a bill we passed unanimously out of the House, out of the legislature, miscellaneous corrections bill. So
Oh,
my
right.
favorite topic. But this is a bill where we really looked at the entire correctional system, and we said, what can we do to get this system working better? And again, my committee is a tripartisan committee: progressive, Republican, Democratic, the whole spectrum of views. And we voted our bills out on unanimous votes, where we said, yeah, here are some things we can do. We can do a better job getting driver's licenses to folks leaving correctional facilities. We can do a better job with prescriptions. We can do a better job imagining the future, where we bring about 120 male inmates that are currently in out-of-state for-profit prison beds in Tallahatchie, Mississippi. We can do a better job envisioning a future where they're in Vermont.
Mhm.
And in our capita bill, I'm very proud we put in language to start envisioning what's called a reentry facility for a male prison population. We're currently already putting away money in planning, doing early design and site selection for a reentry facility for our women. And now in this year, we passed a bill to do that for the men. And we're having these conversations are very nuanced, because there are some people out there saying you cannot have a correctional facility that is trauma informed. It goes against the meaning of it goes against the meaning of the word to say that a correctional facility could be a healthy place for an individual to reside.
Hmm.
And I know that's and yet we need correctional facilities. We have not, as a society, said, okay, we're going to do something entirely different with violent offenders.
Right.
So if we need these facilities, if our current ones are completely outdated and can be harmful to live in, what are we going to do to replace them, while also imagining a system where we maybe need fewer of them, and where the reentry process works better, so that maybe people come back less often, and we could over time reduce that population. So this is a policy conversation we had for many hours in our committee and in the legislature, and I'm proud of it, and I think people are deserving to know that the lawmaking process can work. And I think if you look in any of our committees, you will see, and you have seen, that kind of nuanced conversation. And I'm very proud of the work we do in Montpelier.
Thank you, Tristan. And right on, you landed right on time with the clock. So thank you
Okay.
for that. So yes, I've been speaking with Representative Tristan Roberts, who until January will be representing Wyndham 6 down here in Wilmington, Whitingham, and Halifax. So Tristan, if people, I know you have a podcast, and you have your farm, and you have your essays that you also write. So where can people find all that juicy information?
Thanks, Olga. The one hub for all of that would be it's my name, tristanroberts.org. There you can find my podcast, The Quilnick Experience. I have a reformer column and blog called This Spot on Earth. And You can also find my professional work there, but tristanroberts.org. And I'd love to hear from listeners. What are your questions about corrections? What are your questions about serving in the legislature? Would you like to visit Quilnook Farm here in Halifax? We're also at quilnookfarm.com. And certainly love to hear from people, whether you're local or distant. And thank you, listeners. Thank you, Olga. And again, yeah, my name has been Tristan Roberts. And I'll say that again. You can also email me. I'll put that right in here, tristan@tristanroberts.org. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, and as always, the Montpelier Happy Hour is here on WVEW 107.7 LP Brattleboro, your community radio station, every Friday at 2, rebroadcasted on Wednesday mornings. And you can subscribe to the podcast wherever you find your podcasts. Take care, everyone. Have a good weekend.
Bye-bye.